The throne world of the Valari Empire was beautiful in the way that sharp things are beautiful. Towers of pale crystal rose from the ground like teeth, and the sky above them was always a deep shade of gold. The air smelled faintly of metal and flowers that had no name in any human language. Everything on this world was built to remind visitors that the Valari were old, powerful, and not to be questioned. Princess Ilindra stood at the wide window of her private chamber, watching the ships arrive. They came from every corner of the known galaxy, long silver vessels from the Korath Federation, dark armored cruisers from the Drenni clans, and sleek trading ships from the Mavari Commerce League. The summit was her idea, or at least the Imperial Council had allowed her to believe it was. Dozens of species would gather here to discuss borders, trade, and the ever-shifting balance of power. Ilindra had spent months preparing for it. She intended to prove to her father, the Emperor, that she could handle the weight of diplomacy. She was tall for a Valari woman, with silver-white skin and eyes the color of deep water. Her dark hair was pulled back and held in place by thin chains of gold. She carried herself the way her tutors had taught her, straight, still, and without warmth. Kindness, they had told her since childhood, was a thing lesser species used to hide their weakness. The Valari did not need it. Among the arriving delegations was one she barely noticed. A small human shuttle landed at the far edge of the docking platform, away from the grander ships. It was old, a little dented, and clearly not designed to impress anyone. A handful of humans stepped out, dressed in plain gray uniforms. They looked around at the crystal towers with wide eyes, the way travelers do when they arrive somewhere that makes them feel very small. Leading them was a man named Ethan Cole. He was not loud. He had brown hair that was starting to show a few early streaks of gray at the sides, and his face carried the kind of lines that come from years of squinting into bright suns on faraway worlds. His uniform was clean but simple, and he wore no medals or marks of rank beyond a small silver pin that identified him as a diplomatic attaché, the lowest rank in the human delegation that still allowed someone to sit at a negotiation table. Ethan stepped onto the Valari docking platform and felt the warm air press against his skin. He looked up at the towers and said nothing. The other members of his team whispered to each other in excitement and nerves, but Ethan just stood still for a moment, breathing slowly, like a man who had returned to a place he never expected to see again. He had been here before, not to this city, not to this platform, but to this empire, to this world of golden skies and people who looked through humans like they were made of glass. 8 years ago, Ethan had been 20 years old and working as an aid worker on a border moon called Restus 4. It was a miserable little rock caught between human and Valari space, too small to matter to anyone important, and too remote for anyone to care about the people living there. Ethan had been stationed at a supply outpost, handing out water purification tablets and patching up miners who got hurt in cave-ins. It was not glamorous work, but it was honest, and he believed in it. One night, a Valari shuttle had fallen out of the sky. He heard it first, a terrible screeching sound, like metal being torn apart by giant hands. Then he saw the fire cutting across the violet sky, and then the crash, somewhere in the acid flats to the east. The acid flats were a stretch of open ground where the rain fell sharp and burning. Nobody went out there without full protective gear, and even then, not for long. Ethan went anyway. He grabbed a filter mask, a medical kit, and a jug of water, and he ran. It took him an hour to reach the crash site. The shuttle was broken open like an egg. Inside, he found bodies, Valari soldiers, all dead from the impact. And in the back compartment, still strapped to her seat, was a young woman. She was alive, but barely. Her silver skin was cut in a dozen places, and a deep gash ran across her collarbone. She was shaking, her dark eyes wide with fear and pain. Ethan didn't know she was a princess. He didn't know she was anyone important at all. She was just a person who was hurt and scared and alone in a place where the rain could melt skin. He cut her free from the seat harness with his belt knife. He used strips torn from his own shirt to bandage her wounds. The gash on her collarbone was deep, and he stitched it closed with a sewing needle and thread from his kit. His hands steady, even though the acid wind was starting to pick up outside. She cried out when the needle went in, and he told her quietly that he was sorry, that it would be over soon, that she was going to be okay. She didn't understand his language, and he didn't understand hers, but the tone of his voice was enough. She gripped his arm and held on, and he let her. The acid storms hit hard that night. Ethan wrapped the young woman in a thermal blanket and carried her on his back when she couldn't walk. He moved through the burning rain for 3 days, navigating by the stars when the sky cleared and by memory when it didn't. His mask cracked on the second day, and the acid got into his lungs. He coughed blood into his sleeve and kept walking. On the third day, he reached an emergency beacon and activated it. Velari military ships arrived within hours. Soldiers in gleaming armor poured out, took the young woman from his arms, and carried her away without a single word to him. One of them shoved him aside when he tried to follow. Another looked at him the way a person looks at a stray animal, with brief curiosity and no feeling at all. Ethan sat on the ground, bleeding and exhausted, and watched them leave. Nobody asked his name. Nobody thanked him. Nobody even looked back. The young woman, dazed, drugged for pain, half-conscious, was placed into a medical pod and flown home. She would recover fully. The scar on her collarbone would fade to a thin white line. She would grow up to become the sharp, proud princess who now stood at a crystal window watching ships arrive for her summit. She never learned the name of the human who saved her. And now Ethan Cole stood on her docking platform, 8 years older, with scars on his hands and acid damage in his lungs that made him cough on cold mornings. He looked up at the golden sky of the throne world and remembered a violet sky on a dying moon, and a frightened girl who held his arm in the dark. He said nothing to anyone about it. He picked up his bag, followed his team toward the guest quarters, and kept his eyes forward. There was work to do, and Ethan Cole had never been the kind of man who expected to be remembered. The summit began on the second morning, inside the Hall of Voices, a vast circular chamber at the heart of the Imperial Palace. The ceiling was so high it disappeared into shadow, and the walls were lined with carved stone faces of every Velari emperor who had ever ruled. Their hollow eyes watched everything. Delegations from 9 species filled the chamber. Each group sat behind long, curved tables, arranged in a half-circle, facing the imperial platform, where Princess Elindra sat beside her father's empty throne. The emperor himself had not come. He rarely did anymore. His health was failing, and the court whispered that Elindra would soon carry the full weight of the empire. She sat very still in her chair, her hands folded, her expression carved from stone. She had practiced this face in the mirror since she was 12 years old. The first 2 days of the summit dealt with minor border adjustments and trade agreements. It was slow, careful work, the kind of diplomacy that moved in small steps and polite words. Elindra handled it well. She spoke clearly, gave nothing away, and guided the discussions with the quiet confidence of someone who had studied every file and memorized every name. On the third day, the real business began. The Velari Empire wanted to annex a human colony called New Avalon. New Avalon sat on the edge of a resource-rich system that the Velari had claimed on old star maps drawn centuries before humans ever left their home planet. The humans had settled there 40 years ago, when the system appeared empty and unclaimed. They built homes, farms, schools, and hospitals. 40,000 people lived there now. Children had been born there who had never known any other home. But the Valari maps said the system was theirs, and the Empire did not forget its claims. Aelindra stood and presented the case for annexation in calm, measured words. She displayed the old maps on a holographic screen. She cited Valari's stellar law. She made it sound clean and logical, like solving a math problem. The system belonged to the Valari by historical right, and the human presence there was, legally speaking, an unauthorized settlement on imperial territory. She proposed a peaceful transition. The humans would be relocated, compensated fairly, and given assistance finding a new colony site. She did not use the word eviction. She didn't need to. Everyone in the room understood what she meant. The human delegation sat at the far end of the half-circle. There were only 5 of them: a senior diplomat named Laura Bright, 2 assistants, a legal analyst, and Ethan Cole. They were outnumbered and outranked by every other group in the room. Laura Bright responded first. She was a calm woman in her 50s, with short gray hair and steady hands. She thanked the princess for her presentation, and respectfully stated that the human government did not recognize the Valari claim. The maps were drawn before first contact between their species. No Valari had ever set foot in the system. The human settlers had built everything there from nothing, and they had been living there for 2 generations. Aelindra listened politely, and then repeated her position, as if Laura had simply not understood it the first time. That was when Ethan spoke. He stood slowly, the way someone stands when they know they will not be welcomed. He introduced himself as the delegation's cultural and legal liaison, and then, in flawless Valari, a language most humans never bothered to learn, he asked the princess a question. He asked her if she was aware of the Treaty of Kisara, signed 212 years ago between the Valari Empire and the Galactic Boundary Council. The treaty stated that any territorial claim older than 100 years that had not been physically occupied or actively maintained would be considered void under interstellar boundary law. The room went quiet. Aelindra stared at him. She had not expected any human to know about the Treaty of Kisara. Half her own advisors didn't know about it. It was buried in old legal archives that most people had forgotten existed. She recovered quickly. She told him that the treaty had been signed under a previous emperor, and that the current imperial government considered it outdated. Ethan nodded respectfully, and said he understood her position, but pointed out that the Valari Empire had cited that same treaty just 11 years ago to dismiss a Korath claim on a different system. The treaty was either valid or it wasn't. It couldn't be both. Several delegates from other species shifted in their seats. A few of the Korath representatives exchanged glances. Aelindra felt the ground beneath her argument crack, just slightly, just enough to notice. She ended the session early, saying that the discussion would continue the next day. That evening, in her private chamber, Aelindra paced. She was not angry at the legal challenge. She could work around that. What bothered her was the man who had made it. A low-ranking human attaché, standing in the Hall of Voices, speaking her language better than some of her own courtiers, pulling forgotten treaties out of thin air like a magician pulling cards from a sleeve. Who was he? She pulled up his file on her display screen. Ethan Cole, born on Earth, former aid worker, no military record, no political connections. Transferred to the diplomatic corps 6 years ago after some incident on a border moon that the file didn't bother to explain. He had served at 3 postings since then, all of them small and unimportant. He spoke 4 alien languages fluently, including Valari. His performance reviews described him as quiet, reliable, and unlikely to advance further. There was nothing special about him on paper, and yet something about him scratched at the back of her mind, like a word she couldn't remember. She closed the file and told herself it didn't matter. Meanwhile, deep in the military wing of the palace, General Vorath was losing patience. Vorath was a tall, broad Velari male with a face like a closed fist. He had commanded the Imperial fleet for 20 years and believed that diplomacy was a waste of time. He had argued against the summit from the beginning. The human colony was sitting on a fortune in rare minerals, and every day spent talking was a day the Empire wasn't mining. He stood in his command room, surrounded by holographic star maps, and spoke quietly with 3 of his most loyal captains. The plan was simple. While the summit dragged on, Vorath would move a strike force into position near New Avalon. If the diplomacy failed, or even if it didn't, he would take the colony by force and present the Empire with a victory it could not refuse. He did not tell Elindra. He did not tell the Council. He told himself that he was doing what was necessary, because leaders who wait for permission never lead at all. Back in the guest quarters, Ethan sat alone in his small room. It was clean but plain. A narrow bed, a desk, a window that looked out onto a garden of pale blue flowers. He sat on the edge of the bed and rubbed the scars on his hands. His lungs ached, the way they always did in warm, dry air. He coughed quietly into his sleeve and checked for blood. There was none tonight. That was good. Laura Bright knocked on his door and came in without waiting. She sat across from him and told him he had done well today, but warned him not to push too hard. The Velari did not like being embarrassed in their own hall, especially not by humans. Ethan nodded and said he understood. Laura studied him for a moment. She had known Ethan for 4 years, and in all that time she had never once seen him raise his voice or lose his temper. She had also never seen him talk about himself, about his past, or about why he had learned to speak Velari so perfectly. She asked him once, early on, and he had simply said that he believed in understanding people, even the ones who didn't want to understand him. She left his room and walked back to her own, thinking that Ethan Cole was either the most patient man she had ever met or the saddest, and she wasn't sure there was a difference. Ethan turned off the light and lay in the dark, listening to the strange sounds of the Velari night, distant chimes, the hum of energy fields, the soft rustle of those blue flowers in the garden below. He thought about the princess sitting in her crystal tower, repeating old claims over old maps. And he thought about 40,000 people on New Avalon who had never hurt anyone and just wanted to keep their homes. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but sleep had never come easily to him. It hadn't since Restus 4. The acid storms still raged behind his eyelids every time the lights went out. So he lay there, breathing slowly, and waited for morning the way he always did, quietly and alone. The days that followed were filled with the slow, grinding work of diplomacy. Arguments made and countered, documents passed across tables, long silences filled with the sound of translators whispering into earpieces. The New Avalon question remained unresolved, and with each passing session, the tension in the Hall of Voices grew a little thicker. On the 5th day, Elindra made a decision that surprised her own advisors. She proposed the creation of a small subcommittee to review the historical boundary records related to the disputed system. The committee would include representatives from both the Velari and human delegations, along with a neutral observer from the Mavari Commerce League. Its purpose was to examine the legal evidence calmly and thoroughly, away from the political theater of the main hall. Her advisors didn't like it. They said it gave the humans too much legitimacy, that it treated a settled imperial claim as if it were open for debate. Elindra told them it was a stalling tactic. Nothing more. A way to keep the humans busy while she worked on building support from the other delegations. They accepted this explanation, though not all of them believed it. The truth was simpler and stranger. Aelindra wanted to understand how a low-ranking human diplomat had known more about Velari law than her own legal team. The subcommittee gave her a reason to be in the same room as Ethan Cole, without it looking like curiosity. The archive rooms were deep beneath the palace, carved into the bedrock of the throne world. The ceilings were low, the lighting was warm, and the walls were lined with data crystals containing centuries of imperial records. It was the quietest place in the palace, and for the first time since the summit began, Aelindra felt something close to calm. Ethan arrived each morning exactly on time, carrying the worn leather notebook and a small pen. Actual paper and ink, which the Velari archivist stared at like it was an artifact from a museum. He sat at the opposite end of the long table from Aelindra and worked in silence, reading documents on the display screen, making notes in his book, occasionally asking the archivists for access to older files. He never spoke first. He never looked at her for longer than a moment. He was polite, careful, and completely unreachable. This irritated Aelindra more than she wanted to admit. On the second day in the archives, she broke the silence. She asked him where he had learned to read classical Velari script, which was different from the modern language, and significantly harder. Most Velari scholars struggled with it. Ethan looked up from his notebook and told her he had taught himself, using old religious texts he had found at a trading post on the edge of Velari space. He said he had always believed that if you wanted to understand a people, you had to read what they wrote when they thought no one else would ever read it. Aelindra didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing and went back to her work. But the silence between them had changed. It was no longer cold. It was just quiet. Over the following days, they talked more. It happened gradually, the way water finds cracks in stone. Aelindra would ask a question about a document, and Ethan would answer, and the answer would lead to another question, and then to a conversation that had nothing to do with boundary records at all. Ethan told her about New Avalon, not the legal arguments or the mineral surveys, but the people. He told her about a farmer named Danny Watts, who had figured out how to grow wheat in alien soil by mixing it with crushed local rock. He told her about a teacher named Grace Kim, who ran a school in a converted cargo container, and taught children to read using books she printed herself on a hand-press machine. He told her about a doctor named Sam Ortiz, who had walked 6 miles through a dust storm to deliver a baby because the transport shuttle was broken. He told her these stories simply and without drama, the way a person describes things they have seen with their own eyes. He didn't argue that the colony should be saved. He didn't ask her to feel guilty. He just told her what was there. Aelindra listened. She didn't want to, but she did. One evening, when the archivists had gone home, and the two of them were alone in the warm light of the archive room, Ethan mentioned something in passing. He was talking about hostile environments, the kinds of places humans had settled over the years, places no one else wanted. He said that some of the worst were acid worlds, where the rain burned through clothing and skin. He said the sound of acid rain hitting a shuttle hull was something you never forgot, a soft, steady hiss, like 1,000 whispers all at once. Aelindra's hands stopped moving. She stared at the document in front of her, but she wasn't reading it. She was hearing that sound in her memory, the hiss of rain on metal, the smell of burning air, the feeling of a rough bandage being wrapped around her collarbone by hands that were gentle despite being covered in blisters. She looked up at Ethan. He was writing in his notebook, his face calm, unaware of what he had just done. She studied his hands, scarred, rough, the kind of hands that had worked hard in bad places. She noticed the way he held his pen, with his left hand. and she saw a faded scar running across the back of it, from the base of his thumb to his wrist. She remembered hands like those, younger, but the same shape, the same steadiness. Her heart started beating faster, and she didn't understand why. She excused herself, saying she had a meeting to prepare for. Ethan nodded politely and wished her a good evening. She walked out of the archive room and didn't look back. That night, Alindra could not sleep. She sat in her chamber and searched the Imperial database for records of the Restus 4 incident. It took her 2 hours to find anything at all. The records were incomplete, filed carelessly, and marked as low priority. A Vylari royal shuttle had crashed on the border moon during a diplomatic visit. All crew members were killed. One passenger, identified only as a member of the royal household, was recovered alive 3 days later by a military rescue team. There was no mention of a human aid worker. There was no mention of anyone carrying the survivor through acid storms. There was no mention of a boy with blistered hands stitching a wound closed with a sewing needle. The Vylari military had simply not considered it worth recording. Alindra sat back in her chair and pressed her hands against her face. She could feel the thin scar on her collarbone through the fabric of her robe. She had carried it for 8 years. She had never known who gave it to her, not the wound, but the repair, the clumsy, careful stitching that had kept her from bleeding to death in a wrecked shuttle on a forgotten moon. She thought about Ethan Cole, sitting in the archive room with his paper notebook and his quiet voice, and his scarred hands. She thought about how he spoke her language like he had loved it, how he told stories about human farmers and teachers and doctors like they were the most important people in the galaxy, how he never once raised his voice or showed anger, even when her empire was trying to take everything his people had built. She thought about the way he tilted his head when he listened, slightly to the left, as if he was trying to hear something just beyond the edge of sound. The boy on Restus 4 had done the same thing. She remembered it now, clear as glass. He had tilted his head just like that when she tried to speak to him through the pain, leaning in close, trying to understand words in a language he didn't know. Alindra wanted to ask him. She wanted to walk to the guest quarters, knock on his door, and say the words out loud. But pride held her in place, like chains. To admit that a human had saved her life, that a human had done what her own soldiers had failed to do, would mean admitting that everything she had been taught about humans was incomplete. It would mean her empire owed a debt it had never acknowledged. It would mean she owed a debt she had never even known existed. So she sat in the dark, alone with the knowledge that was building inside her like pressure behind a dam, and she told herself she would deal with it tomorrow. Tomorrow, she told herself. But tomorrow was already too late, and the sound of warships was already moving through the dark spaces between the stars. The alarms woke Alindra at dawn. She was on her feet before she fully understood what was happening. Red light pulsed through her chamber, and the deep vibration of the palace defense grid hummed through the floor beneath her bare feet. She pulled on her robe and opened the door to find 2 of her personal guards standing there, their faces tight with something she had never seen on Vylari soldiers before: confusion. General Vorath had launched his strike fleet 4 hours ago. 12 warships, including 2 heavy cruisers, had jumped to faster-than-light speed during the night, and were now on course for the new Avalon system. Vorath had used his personal authority codes to bypass the standard fleet command chain. He had told his captains that the order came from the Imperial Council. It hadn't. The Council didn't even know. Alindra stood in the corridor and felt the cold rush through her body like ice water. She had been outmaneuvered. While she sat in archive rooms, reading old treaties and listening to stories about human farmers, Vorath had been moving his pieces across the board. He had never intended to let diplomacy work. He had been waiting for the right moment, and the summit had given him the perfect cover. She moved fast. She dressed, called an emergency meeting of her senior advisors, and sent a message to the Imperial Council demanding an explanation. The council responded within the hour. They were as shocked as she was. Vorath had acted alone, without authorization. But the ships were already in transit, and recalling them would take time the colony didn't have. The summit collapsed in minutes. Word spread through the delegations like fire. The Korath pulled out first, unwilling to be present when an empire started a war. The Drenni stayed, but only because they wanted to watch. And the human delegation was placed under guard. Aelindra ordered it herself, though she used careful words. She called it protective custody, and said it was for their own safety during the crisis. Laura Bright, the senior human diplomat, looked at Aelindra through the doorway of the guest quarters and said nothing. Her silence was louder than any protest. Ethan Cole was among those confined. He stood at the back of the group, his face calm, his hands still. He watched the Valeri guards take positions outside the doors and windows, and he noticed something the others didn't. The guards were facing inward, not outward. They weren't protecting the humans. They were containing them. He waited. He waited until the middle of the night when the guard rotation shifted, and there was a gap of 90 seconds between the old guards leaving and the new ones arriving. He had been counting the rotations since the lockdown began, and the gap was always exactly the same. Valeri military discipline was precise, which made it predictable. Ethan moved through the gap like smoke. He slipped into a service corridor that ran behind the guest quarters, a maintenance tunnel used by cleaning crews and repair workers. He had noticed it on his second day at the palace, when he took a wrong turn looking for the archive rooms. Most people wouldn't have remembered it. Ethan remembered everything about buildings. It was a habit he had picked up on Restus 4, where knowing the layout of a structure could mean the difference between getting out alive and not getting out at all. The tunnels were narrow and dark, lit only by dim strips of emergency lighting along the floor. He moved quickly, but carefully, counting turns, checking for security sensors. The Valeri didn't monitor their maintenance tunnels well. Another weakness of a people who believed no one would ever dare to walk where they weren't invited. It took him 40 minutes to reach the palace communication center. It was a small room on the lower level, used for routine administrative messages. The main military communication array was far too heavily guarded, but this civilian relay could still reach deep space if the signal was boosted. Ethan sat down at the console and worked quickly. His fingers moved across the controls with the ease of someone who had studied Valeri technology the way other people studied music. Not just to use it, but to understand it. He rerouted the signal through 3 relay stations, boosted the power output by borrowing energy from the building's climate control system, and aimed the transmission at a point in space 2 systems away where a small human patrol fleet was stationed. He recorded it in plain speech. No code, no encryption. There wasn't time. This is Ethan Cole, diplomatic attaché, human delegation to the Valeri Summit. A Valeri strike force of 12 warships has launched an unauthorized attack on New Avalon. Estimated arrival in the colony system is 14 hours. This is not a drill. 40,000 civilians are in danger. Please respond. Please hurry. He sent it. Then he sent it again. Then a third time, on a slightly different frequency, in case the first 2 were blocked. Then he sat back in the chair and breathed. He knew what would happen next. The signal boost would trigger an energy alert in the palace systems. Someone would trace it. They would find him here, and they would not be gentle about it. He had maybe 10 minutes. He used 5 of them to delete his transmission logs and scramble the relay codes so they couldn't be used to jam the signal after it was sent. He used the other 5 to sit quietly and think about New Avalon, about Danny Watts and his wheat fields, about Grace Kim and her cargo container school, about Sam Ortiz walking through a dust storm to bring a new life into the world. Then the door burst open, and Vorath's soldiers poured in. There were 6 of them, armored and armed. They didn't ask questions. The first one hit Ethan across the face with an armored fist, and he went down hard. They beat him on the floor of the communication room. Fists, boots, the butt of a rifle against his ribs. He didn't fight back. He couldn't have, even if he'd wanted to. He was one man, unarmed, with damaged lungs and old scars. He curled up and protected his head with his arms, and took it. When they were finished, they dragged him through the palace corridors by his arms, his feet trailing on the polished floor, leaving a thin smear of blood on the crystal tiles. They brought him to the throne room. Alindra was there. She had been summoned by Vorath, who stood beside the empty throne, with his hands behind his back, and a look of grim satisfaction on his hard face. He told the princess that the human spy had been caught, attempting to send a military transmission from inside the palace. He recommended immediate execution under wartime security law. Ethan was dropped on the floor in front of the platform. He landed on his hands and knees, coughing, blood dripping from a cut above his eye. He took a breath, and then another, and then he raised his head. He looked at Alindra, and Alindra looked at him. She saw the blood on his face, the swelling around his left eye, the way he held his ribs with one arm. She saw his hands pressed flat against the cold floor, scarred hands, steady even now, the left one with that faded line running from thumb to wrist. She saw him kneeling there, beaten and surrounded, and she saw that he was not afraid. He was not begging. He was not angry. He was just looking at her, with quiet, steady eyes, the way someone looks at a person they have known in a different life. And everything fell into place. The tilt of his head, the patience, the hands, the way he spoke about people like they mattered, all of them, even the ones who would never thank him for it. The boy on Restus 4 who had carried her through acid rain for 3 days, and never asked for anything in return. Aelindra's hands began to tremble. She pressed them flat against the arms of her chair, to hide it. Vorath was speaking. He was demanding authorization for the execution. He was talking about security, about precedent, about the message it would send. Aelindra heard none of it. She raised one hand, and the room went silent. "No," she said. Her voice was steady, though her hands were not. "He will not be executed. He will be imprisoned and held for diplomatic proceedings. This is not a battlefield, General. It is my palace, and he is a member of a foreign delegation under my protection." Vorath's face darkened. He argued. He pressed. He told her she was making a mistake that would be remembered. Aelindra looked at him with the cold, sharp expression she had practiced since she was 12 years old, and she said, "So will you, General, if you speak to me that way again." Vorath shut his mouth. The soldiers took Ethan away. That night, when the palace was dark and the guards were at their posts, Aelindra walked alone to the detention level. She dismissed the guards outside Ethan's cell. They hesitated, but they obeyed. She stood at the cell door and looked through the small window. Ethan was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow and uneven. His face was swollen and bruised. Blood had dried in a dark line from his hairline to his jaw. She opened the door and stepped inside. He opened his eyes and looked at her. He couldn't. Aelindra stood over him for a long moment, and then she said the words she had been carrying since the archive room, since the night she searched the database, since the moment she first heard the hiss of acid rain in her memory. "The border moon," she said quietly. "That was you. It was not a question." Ethan looked at her. His swollen eyes held no accusation, no triumph, no bitterness. He simply nodded. She asked him why he never said anything, why he came to the summit, stood in her hall, worked beside her in the archive room, and never once told her who he was. Ethan was quiet for a long time. Then he said in her language, in the soft, careful Veilari he had taught himself from old books, "Because it wouldn't have changed anything. Your empire doesn't owe me anything for what I did. I didn't carry you through that storm, so you would owe me. I carried you because you were hurt, and you were alone, and that was enough." Alindra stood in the cell and felt something inside her crack open, something old and hard, and carefully built, something her tutors and her empire and her golden towers had taught her to keep sealed shut. She left without another word. But she did not sleep that night. And when the sun rose gold over the throne world, the woman who walked out of her chamber was not quite the same woman who had walked in. The battle for New Avalon began at midday, measured by the colony's local time. Vorath's strike force dropped out of faster-than-light travel on the edge of the system and moved toward the colony world in attack formation. 12 warships in a sharp wedge, their weapons already powered, their shields glowing faint blue against the black of space. From the bridge of his flagship, Vorath watched the planet grow larger on his screen, and felt the satisfaction of a man who believed he was writing history. He expected no resistance. Human ships were smaller, slower, and fewer. The nearest human military outpost was 2 systems away, and by his calculations, they could not have received warning in time. He was wrong. Ethan's message had reached the human patrol fleet 7 hours before the Veilari strike force arrived. Commander Lisa Grant, a woman with short red hair and 20 years of service, read the transmission twice, swore once, and gave the order to move. The patrol fleet was small. 6 frigates and 2 destroyers, none of them designed for a fight against heavy Veilari cruisers. But Lisa Grant had not joined the fleet to run from fights she couldn't win. She had joined because she believed that some things were worth standing in front of, even when the math said you shouldn't. The human ships arrived in the New Avalon system 3 hours before Vorath. They took position in a defensive arc between the planet and the system's outer approach corridor. Lisa ordered every civilian transport on the planet to begin evacuation procedures immediately. 40,000 people had to move, and they had less than 3 hours to do it. New Avalon erupted into motion. Families grabbed what they could carry. Parents lifted children onto transport shuttles. Danny Watts left his wheat fields without looking back. Grace Kim loaded her students onto a cargo ship and counted heads 3 times to make sure no one was missing. Sam Ortiz carried medical supplies to the evacuation point and kept working until the last shuttle was full. They moved fast because they had to, and because humans had always been good at leaving places they loved when the alternative was dying in them. When Vorath's fleet arrived, the human warships were waiting. The Veilari general looked at the 6 frigates and 2 destroyers arranged in his path and almost laughed. He outnumbered them nearly 2 to 1, and his ships outweighed theirs by a factor of 5. He opened a communication channel and told the human commander to stand aside. He promised that the colonists would not be harmed if they surrendered the planet peacefully. Lisa Grant's reply was 4 words long: "Come and take it." The battle began. It was not a fair fight. It was never going to be. The Veilari ships hit harder, moved faster in straight lines, and had shields that could absorb punishment the human frigates couldn't dream of delivering. In the first 10 minutes, 2 human frigates were crippled, their engines torn apart by concentrated fire, their hulls venting atmosphere into the vacuum. But the human ships did not break formation. They held their arc. They absorbed the hits and kept firing. The 2 destroyers, the Hannah Lee and the Bright Morning, anchored the center of the line and poured everything they had into the leading Veilari cruiser. Their weapons were not powerful enough to destroy it, but they didn't need to destroy it. They needed to slow it down, to make it bleed, to buy minutes for the transports lifting off from the planet below. And the humans fought in ways the Velari did not expect. But they were also more agile, designed by a species that had always been outnumbered, and had learned to make up for it with speed and stubbornness. The frigates darted between the larger Velari vessels, staying close enough that the cruisers couldn't use their heaviest weapons without risking damage to their own ships. It was reckless. It was dangerous. It was exactly the kind of thing that made other species shake their heads at humans and wonder how they had survived long enough to reach the stars. Lisa Grant commanded from the bridge of the Bright Morning, her voice steady on the fleet channel, calling out targets, adjusting formation, pulling damaged ships back, and pushing fresh ones forward. She took a hit on her port side that killed 6 of her crew and blew out half the lights on her bridge. She kept commanding in the dark, by memory and instinct. The battle lasted 2 hours and 41 minutes. By the end of it, 4 human frigates were destroyed or too damaged to fight. The Bright Morning had lost its main engines and was drifting. The Hannah Lee was burning from 3 separate hull breaches. 92 human crew members were dead, but every transport had made it out. Every single one. 40,000 people, men, women, children, farmers, teachers, doctors, miners, were alive and moving through deep space towards safety, because 6 frigates and 2 destroyers had stood in front of them and refused to move. Vorath took the planet. He landed his troops on empty streets. He walked through abandoned homes, where meals were still sitting on tables and children's toys were scattered on floors. He had won the ground, but there was no one left to conquer. The victory tasted like dust in his mouth, though he would never admit it. Back on the throne world, Aelindra moved. She had spent the hours of the battle in the Imperial Council chamber, doing the coldest, most precise political work of her life. She laid out the evidence of Vorath's unauthorized action, the bypassed command codes, the forged orders, the secret communications with his captains. She presented it calmly, without emotion, document by document, like building a wall 1 brick at a time. The council members listened. Some of them had quietly supported Vorath. Some of them had hoped the attack would succeed cleanly so they could claim the minerals without the mess of diplomacy. But now the mess was here. Dead human soldiers, a destroyed colony, a diplomatic crisis that would turn every other species in the galaxy against the Velari for years to come. She offered them Vorath. She framed him as a rogue commander, acting against the will of the Empire. She argued that the Velari could preserve their reputation by arresting him, withdrawing from New Avalon, and entering into genuine negotiations with the humans. It was not justice. It was politics. But it was the only move that kept the Empire from being isolated and sanctioned by every major power in the region. The council voted. Vorath was recalled and arrested. The withdrawal order was sent. Aelindra stood in the council chamber after the vote and felt nothing like victory. She felt hollow, like a building after a fire, still standing, but empty inside. She went to the detention level. She had ordered Ethan released an hour ago. When she arrived, she expected to find him waiting. Instead, she found a medical team and a stretcher. Ethan had collapsed in his cell sometime in the night. The beating from Vorath's soldiers had been worse than anyone realized. His ribs were broken in 4 places, and one of them had shifted and punctured something inside him. He had been bleeding internally for hours, quietly, without calling for help. The guards hadn't checked on him. Nobody had. He was alive when they found him, but barely. His skin was gray, and his breathing was the thin, shallow kind that comes when a body is running out of time. They rushed him to the palace medical bay, where Velari physicians worked over him with instruments designed for Velari bodies and had to guess at the differences in human anatomy. Aelindra stood outside the medical bay, watching through the glass wall. She could see Ethan on the table, small, still, surrounded by machines and doctors and blue light. She could see the scars on his hands. the ones he had earned carrying a frightened girl through acid rain on a forgotten moon 8 years ago. She pressed her hand flat against the glass and said nothing. The Vailari doctors stabilized him. They stopped the bleeding. They patched his broken ribs with bioadhesive and pumped synthetic blood into his veins. He would live, they told her. But the damage to his lungs, the old damage from Restus 4, made worse by the beating, was severe. His body would never fully recover. He would carry this for the rest of his life, like a stone in his chest that he could never put down. When the human medical team arrived, sent from the returning patrol fleet, they took over his care. They were efficient and professional, but their faces were hard when they looked at Alindra. The trust between their species, already thin, had been shattered. The human delegation was released. Laura Bright organized the departure without speaking to any Vailari official. She moved through the palace like a woman walking through a house where something terrible had happened, touching nothing, looking at no one. Ethan was carried to the human shuttle on a stretcher. Before they loaded him aboard, one of the medics handed Alindra a small data chip. He told her that Ethan had asked them to give it to her. That was all. Alindra stood on the docking platform and watched the human shuttle lift off. It rose into the golden sky, small and dented and unimpressive, just as it had been when it arrived. She watched it until it was a speck, and then until it was nothing at all. She went to her chamber alone and inserted the data chip into her display. It contained a single file, an image, a photograph taken with a cheap handheld camera, the kind aid workers carried on remote postings. It showed a sky clearing after a storm on Restus 4. The clouds were pulling apart to reveal a deep, impossible shade of violet, and the light was breaking through in long golden rays that turned the acid flats into something that almost looked beautiful. There was no message attached, no words, no accusation, no farewell, just a sky that a 20-year-old boy had looked at after carrying a stranger through hell and thought was worth remembering. Alindra sat with the image on her screen for a very long time. The next morning, she stood before the Imperial Council and began the long, dangerous work of changing her empire. She proposed new laws governing military authority, new frameworks for dealing with human colonies, new diplomatic channels that would treat humans as partners rather than problems. The council resisted. They argued. They called her soft. She weathered it the way Ethan had weathered acid storms, by putting her head down and walking forward, step after step, because that was the only direction that mattered. She did not mention Ethan Cole by name, not in the council chamber, not in the press statements, not in the new treaties that would take years to finalize. His name appeared nowhere in the official record of the summit, just as it had appeared nowhere in the records of Restus 4. But every decision she made from that day forward carried his weight. Every time she chose patience over force, understanding over pride, listening over speaking. She was paying a debt that no document recorded and no treaty covered, a debt owed to a quiet man with scarred hands who had saved her life twice and asked for nothing both times. Years later, when historians wrote about the great reform of the Vailari Empire, they would credit Princess Alindra's political skill and vision. They would analyze her strategies, study her speeches, and debate her legacy. They would never know about the boy on the border moon, or the photograph of a violet sky, or the man who knelt bleeding on a throne room floor and still did not ask for anything in return. But Alindra knew. She kept the photograph on a private display in her chamber, where no one else could see it. And on the nights when the work was hardest and the loneliness was sharpest, and her empire felt like a weight she could not carry, she would look at that clearing sky and remember that the strongest thing she had ever witnessed was not a warship or a weapon or a crown. It was a human, choosing to be kind, when the world gave him every reason not to be. And she would sit with that knowledge, and the ache of having recognized it too late. And she would get up in the morning and try to be worthy of it. That was the most she could do. That was the most anyone could do. And it was enough.